So thank you to everyone joining us online and in person. The second session, or the first panel, is going to take up questions emerging out of the move to cash assistance in the humanitarian sector, which has really caught fire in the last 5 years or so, and especially in the last 10 years. Cash and voucher assistance now constitutes roughly 20% of humanitarian aid distributed through major donors and INGOs, and far more of the uncounted direct aid and solidarity between people in affected communities. So there are a few different counts, but it totals to over $5.7 billion annually. Not a huge number in terms of global economic flows, but a lot of cash moving into communities that have been disrupted in one way or another. So with this landscape in mind, we've invited our participants to think about cash assistance in particular, in the humanitarian sector more broadly, and how the move to digital cash assistance in particular has changed things. So we'll explore where digital cash assistance might and perhaps might not take us, and we've asked our panelists to think broadly and to feel free to ask thorny questions. What do you think the sources of tension and opportunities in the next 3 to 5 years are for the sector regarding digitalization, cash, and the localization agenda? And what do you find exciting? And also, what do you continue to worry about? Hanna Matinen is joining us from UNHCR, and she is spearheading the global rollout of cash-based programming for UNHCR operations. She began her career with non-governmental organizations, working for over 13 years in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe in various technical and management positions before joining UNHCR in 2011. She's been at the forefront of making cash-based programming work in very difficult contexts, and pioneered humanitarian cash transfers in Africa and in the Caucasus in the early 2000s, and has been a core participant in steering committees, technical advisory, and peer review groups. So we've invited her especially because her experience predates the kind of digital innovation hype that has characterized the last few years. And she currently focuses on operational methodologies that enable rapid response and harness the opportunities that cash transfers offer in promoting refugees and other displaced people's access to financial and digital opportunities. We have Dorothea Hilhorst, who is professor of humanitarian studies at the Institute for Social Studies of Erasmus University in The Hague. She focuses on aid-society relations, and especially how aid is embedded in contexts and is shaped by manifold actions of a variety of actors. Her focus has been in the intersections of development, peace building, and gender. And in 2009, she founded the International Humanitarian Studies Association. She has published widely on disaster, conflict, and humanitarian aid and development. So we're very excited that she could join us today. We also have Liz Hendry with us in person. Thank you, Liz, for traveling to Durham, who is global lead for cash and voucher assistance for the Norwegian Refugee Council. She is also NRC's advisor for the Ukraine Cash Consortium and co-chairs of the Multipurpose Cash Assistance Community of Practice in the Middle East and North Africa, hosted by the CALP Network. Previously, Liz spent nearly 4 years as head of Chameleon, a cash research, accountability, and learning consortium in Lebanon. Liz has worked for NRC since 2014, holding positions as head office and regional level. Prior to this, Liz worked on HIV and AIDS policy in Geneva and for the British Red Cross as a senior researcher, organizational learning specialist, and strategist. So I'm really excited to have such a diverse panel speaking with us today.
Yeah, I'll take you on a quick trip back in time. So this photo was taken some good 20 years ago in a refugee camp in East Africa. And the white piece of plastic that you see wrapped around the lady's wrist is actually extremely valuable. It's her ration card, so which entitled her to get her food and the jerry cans that Karen referred to. But actually, at that time, it also functioned as almost as her ID. So if she was to leave the camp, with this card, she could show that she was a refugee. And in fact, this card is also the high-tech card because you can see the barcode in it. Many of them didn't even have barcodes at the time. And this was before cash assistance was even started. This photo is from last year. So as you can see, the technology has changed, and in many cases we've embraced it. So most of the cash we're doing now is digital. It can be cards, it can be mobile money, it can be cardless withdrawals, etc. But I think Karen was also referring to it slightly. There are still significant limitations when it comes to refugees and displaced populations in particular, which limit the opportunities that digital cash could bring to humanitarian assistance. So one of the key risks that I see that we actually leave someone behind is precisely related to access to identification, access to ID, and know your customer or KYC regulations. In today's world, in many countries, refugees still don't have ID documents that are considered as sufficient for KYC, and hence they can't access the full scope of services or the full scope that digital cash could actually bring to them. So in many cases, we find ourselves looking for different workarounds. So for example, here in Mexico, we're using prepaid cards, which can only be used for getting humanitarian assistance. People cannot receive remittances, people cannot receive their paychecks, or they can't save on the card because of the regulations. Money has to be taken out of the card within 2 to 3 months' time. In other countries, like in Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, we managed to negotiate time-bound exceptions. So we, for example, enabled refugees access to mobile money, but it was only the change in the regulation. It wasn't even a change in the regulation. It was more an agreement that was only valid during the humanitarian assistance program. So this is a total missed opportunity when it comes to like providing services to people and promoting financial inclusion. Ukraine, which we hear about a lot, is slightly different. But even there, for example, in Moldova, the government had to issue a decree that made a change in regulation so that we could rapidly issue digital payments to refugees. So regulations and access to ID still remain key challenges. Another risk that I see is connectivity and smartphone ownership, particularly among refugees and other displaced populations and also in general in the poorer parts of the world. So we found out that while many refugees at the moment do have connectivity, they are still half as likely to have access as compared to their host populations in rural areas. We can also see differences based on gender and disability. We did some reviews in Uganda and in Rwanda and in Bidibidi, which is a camp in Uganda. Refugee women were about 90% less likely to use mobile internet if you compare to refugee men. And in Rwanda, in one camp, refugees with disabilities were actually 15% less likely to have ever used a mobile phone than those without a disability. There's also some emerging research that shows that smartphones can cost over 70% of the average monthly income, which is a significant barrier and actually worries me for future as well, because we know that refugees often tend to be among the poorer parts of the population. Then I have one more photo that I want to show you before my final thoughts that I will leave with you. It's just to remind us that displacement is still an everyday reality in many parts of the world, and the displacement happens in very difficult conditions. So we don't always have connectivity. Digital services or financial services overall can be extremely limited. So my two final thoughts or questions that I want to leave with you is data protection. And that's actually one of the things that could keep me up at nights, especially when you talk about refugees. So what are the risks? Because in many cases, refugees would have left their country due to war or persecution. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is cryptocurrencies. There's a lot of pilots ongoing, and many see it as an opportunity. And this, in a way, makes me think about mobile money, especially in Africa a number of years ago, when the regulations were quite not there yet. So there were a lot of opportunities. And I will not put my head on the table for cryptocurrency. I think there's so much unknowns with it. But I do wonder if this could also present an opportunity to advance things like tiered KYC or risk-based KYC, which takes me back to my first photo and the issues that or the risks that I see with access to ID and KYC. Thank you.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to see all of you. And I'm not sure who is in the room, of course. I'm very sorry I'm not there in person. I was wondering, perhaps there are some of you who are familiar with my work on classical and resilient humanitarianism, which I see as two distinct paradigms that still both, in a way, shape humanitarian action, but sometimes it's much more leaning to classical, sometimes much more to resilience. And I just wanted to go back to the kind of basics of how cash relief is being operated under those two paradigms, and then make some critical notes based on my critical reading of the resilience paradigm. Now, the classical humanitarian aid paradigm, and we all know it, it's grounded in exceptionalism. You know, we have either a conflict, a crisis, or normality, and the two are very different. Under crisis, nothing operates. Everything needs to come from outside, every assistance. Centered therefore on international aid machinery and very much rooted in the principles of humanity, independence, impartiality, and neutrality. I will not, of course, go deeply into it. I just assume this is familiar territory. Now, this is the paradigm that was never perhaps lived paradigm in the sense that the humanitarian action lived up to the promises made as part of the paradigm, but it was nonetheless dominant until the beginning of this century, when we see the shift to resilient humanitarianism. And it's very different. It says, people, communities, and societies have the capacities to adapt to or spring back from tragic life events and disasters. Now, this all started, this paradigm, with disasters in the Yoko framework for action. I mean, disasters caused, like with floods, earthquakes, things like those. But now we also see it in refugee care and other domains of humanitarian aid. Now, I'm just going to this very basic paradigm discussion with you, because it's very interesting to see how cash relief could not only evolve because of evaluations, feedback from people, technical possibilities, but also, and just as much, it had to come from the thinking, the paradigmatic thinking that was sort of ruling humanitarianism. Under classical relief, there is a feeling that people are either incapable or they cannot be trusted because they are perhaps engrossed in a war economy, or they just cannot be trusted to take wisely care of themselves. And that was one of the reasons why the discussion, the debate between cash relief, food aid was so entrenched. There were people convinced that you cannot give money to people, even though they had been working with money their entire life, but not in a crisis, because it will go to the men will drink, men will do all kinds of horrible things with it, will be taken away from women, etc., etc. Now, food aid, therefore, was the favorite method under the classical paradigm. I know I'm taking really huge steps here. I trust not only that you can follow me, but also that you can understand that there's lots more nuance in this story. And I just give you the very big, sort of lines of the story. And I apologize to anyone that feels like, whoa, she's making a really horrible representation of everything we've done. But just bear with me for a second. So in the resilience paradigm, we say, okay, people know their own priority needs. If we give them food, but they actually want education, they will sell the food and pay for the education. So they know their priority needs, and these should just be enabled. And therefore, cash relief can be seen to be the favorite method under this paradigm of resilient humanitarianism. Now, this sounds all very attractive, but there's also been critique on the resilience paradigm. Firstly, it shifts away responsibility. It seems that under the resilience paradigm, we no longer ask, why is there a crisis? Why are there so many disasters? How come that refugees live in such poor conditions? Why is there a conflict? Can we not resolve the conflict? And where is the state? Shouldn't the state take care of the welfare of its people? So in a way, it shifts responsibility back to communities that are supposed to be resilient, back to households. We just give them some cash and they can manage. And we don't ask why they can't manage without our cash anymore. And that is especially relevant in countries that are not in a direct high intensity conflict, but are perhaps under the rule of an authoritarian regime where they are a minority or something like that, and that we may actually want to analyze and critique. Secondly, under the resilience paradigm, we say that it may lead to a disinterest of the international community. Wow, look at these people and this community, they can really manage themselves. Do they need us? Do they need our assistance? And hence, in the end, it could lead to politics of abandonment. Now, again, this is on the paradigm. Now, therefore, I thought, from this thinking around paradigms, I just wanted to flash some concerns with cash relief. I'm very sorry I wasn't able to listen to the keynote. Listening to what I've just heard in the previous contributions, it must have been very fascinating and interesting. I've learned from my colleagues who have just preceded me in the panel and, made some really great points. But these are the points that I prepared before my presentation. First, I think this was covered as well by, Karen Peachy. And she said, you only do cash relief when it's feasible and doable. For example, if there is no food on the market, you only get inflation. That's done. I also heard concerns over digital data with privacy, with who is owning the data. Can they be given on? I mean, there are some scandals. For example, how perhaps the government in Myanmar was able to access lots of data, digital data on Rohingya populations and stuff like that. Now, more at a paradigmatic level, when we say resilience, it really means that we reserve cash relief as well as other types of humanitarian assistance, not just to any refugee, not just to any person on the move, but we reserve it to people who are extra vulnerable, who are especially vulnerable. Not every refugee, not every person on the move gets relief, cash relief, food aid, whichever. They don't always get it. What are those criteria that are being used? Sometimes in a more primitive setting, we see primitive in the humanitarian sense, we see that vulnerability is almost equated to that one word, women and children, forgetting that perhaps for many young men, it's impossible to find jobs. So hence, how can they be resilient? And hence, perhaps they also need some relief. So what are the criteria used for inclusion, exclusion, and how precise are they? Are they just very broad categories, or are they actually looking into individual cases? We cannot always see a handicap of people. You can see it when they're in a wheelchair, but there are many other reasons why people cannot take care of themselves that are less visible to the eye and nonetheless extremely relevant. Sometimes I don't know if I can voice this concern like this, and I'm sure your days will be full of this type of illustrations and research. But I say easy way out. I find it now very unfriendly when I read it back. But humanitarian work is usually much more than providing assistance. There's a social work component to it. Talking to people, finding out how the household is going, what is going on, what is happening. Is that aspect totally abandoned, left to the technical implementation of cash relief with all its advantages? But how are we compensating for that individual care and that interest and that individual asking and talking and listening that we could do to people in other types of systems? Which brings me to the last point, and it relates back to the point that I made about the resilience paradigm around politics of abandonment and shifting of responsibility. If we don't listen anymore to people because they just can go to the bank, they can go with a little card, they have their cash, they move on with all its advantages. But how about seeing people as more than individuals, seeing people as a community, not just a community that cares for each other, but also a community that has a voice, that may want to see things different, that may be looking for change, and that looking for change may need to be enabled, may need to be supported. So here I'm talking about listening, témoignage, they call it in MSF, advocacy in other circles. So how do we make up for the lack of direct contact and individualization of the contact through cash relief? Whereas we would like to work with communities that are trying to look critically at their situation and also be assisted in their advocacy efforts to end the situation in which they find themselves. Thank you very much. I hope this makes sense in the middle of your conference.
It's great to be here today and also to see some familiar faces on the panel as well. I'm going to share a few thoughts based on my experiences of working for NRC, which is a humanitarian organization working in 30 countries with people affected by displacement. So I think to respond to the question about where digital cash can lead us, I mean, certainly it can lead us to scale. And so we've seen that digital cash has meant that programs can be of a size that I think we wouldn't have dreamed of, 10, 15 years ago. You have cases like the Emergency Safety Nets program in Turkey that has a monthly caseload of over 1 million people. Contexts like Lebanon, where I was working before, where caseloads can, supported by the UN, also exceed over 500,000 people. And in my agency, we're not operating at that scale of the Red Cross or the UN, but digital cash is the means in which we're really pushing the boundaries for the number of people that we're reaching, particularly in Ukraine right now. But being part of a big cash program, creates quite a lot of demands on its recipients. So, I think one of the things about being part of a cash program is that if you're a recipient, there's often a number of actions that you have to make, or responsibilities that you have. It could be that you have to go and validate your identity so that agencies can mitigate against fraud. It's often the case that you have to go and cash out your assistance. It might be from a money agent, it might be from an ATM machine. And you also have to interact with a number of different entities as well. So it's not just an agency like NRC who's implementing that you would be in contact with. It might also be the financial service provider that we're working with. And, for many people, there are sort of particular complexities to dealing with technology. And so when I was working in Lebanon, we were really looking at that experience of people who were part of digital cash programs to understand how did they navigate being part of programs when they had never used an ATM machine before leaving Syria. So we did some research that found that 97% of surveyed refugees had not used an ATM machine before arriving in Lebanon. And there was often anxiety or lack of confidence in using ATMs, particularly amongst women and people who were illiterate. And so when we did qualitative research, people talked about some of the strategies that they employed to use ATM machines. So whether it was kind of understanding the sequence of buttons on an ATM machine that corresponded to their PIN code, or recognizing patterns in the SMS messages that they were receiving, but not being able to read the message. And so I think it's really important that agencies that are doing digital cash take the time to understand what experiences of recipients are like, employing methods like user journeys to understand what elements of your program people find easy to navigate and which do people find difficult. And it's also difficult because you often don't have, very much physical contact with people. And so I think that's raising new questions for agencies about how do you communicate empathetically with people through online means. And so at the moment with Ukraine, one of the main means in which we're interacting with communities around cash assistance is Facebook. And so for our teams there, it's a very different experience from what they're used to. whether it's, they've used to working on hotlines or being face-to-face with people, and now they're moderating Facebook pages. And so it's about thinking, how do we do that in the kind of best possible way? And you're balancing that with choices about money as well, because resources are stretched. And so there are questions about how much do you invest in making it a sort of quality experience for people, putting money into communication, into tailoring the program. For big cash programs, where by the kind of nature of their design, they're kind of designed for average users. So I think these are some of the dilemmas that agencies face. And I've just put this graphic up to show that it is a sort of, if we focus particularly on accountability to affected populations, is the term that we often use, it's a continuum, so there's a kind of infinite amount of resources and time you could put into it, but you have to balance that with the fact that the more money you put into that, the less that you're able to provide direct transfers to people. So you need to strike a balance and think about, what does kind of good enough accountability look like in a cash program. I also wanted to highlight that I think an exciting innovation is that different elements of cash delivery are being digitalized. So, we focused quite a lot so far on that kind of last mile of delivery, how people actually receive the transfer. But we're also starting to see that other elements of the process, the project cycle, as we call it, are being digitalized as well. And one of the kind of newer developments in the Ukraine response has been to digitalize how people register people for assistance. So typically we would do kind of face-to-face or kind of phone assessments. But in Ukraine, we have done a self-registration system. So people have been able to apply to NRC to be considered for assistance. And that opportunity has been promoted through Facebook. And one of the advantages to that is that we've been able to reach people on a kind of geographic spread that we wouldn't have been able to do without that digital means. And if we could go to the next slide, Lauren, I just wanted to show you this graph of Ukraine. So when we received applications from people, we asked them, where they were before the invasion and then where they were at the point of applying for assistance. So this is the map that shows where people self-reported say that they were living prior to the invasion. And then if we could go to the next slide, sorry, Lauren, thanks very much. You can see that this is where people were living at the point that they applied for assistance from NRC. So it's, people are on the move. It means that you're able to kind of reach people on a geographic spread and in a kind of more cost-efficient way than we would be able to do if we didn't have technology. But I think the point that Karen made is really important about we still have this tendency to develop sort of lots of separate systems. And unfortunately, it's also happened in Ukraine as well, in that you've got self-registration has kind of become a new development, but you still have a number of agencies who've developed their own self-registration systems. So I think there is this challenge to us that we need to get better at coordinating and designing systems that are sort of better for recipients, because people are having to apply to multiple systems often to be considered for assistance. And then the final point I wanted to make is about links to government social protection systems. So, I think it's kind of well acknowledged in the sector that with the kind of increasing and, increasingly complex crisis that we face, and with resources being continually stretched, that it's not sustainable to do what we're doing at the moment, which is humanitarian agencies year on year delivering cash assistance. We need to have a more sort of sustainable system. And really the key opportunity for this is that we link more to and shift the power towards, governments and find ways to kind of align ourselves with existing social protection systems, and also find ways of kind of strengthening those that are already in place. So, I mean, I think there's been a lot sort of discussed and documented on this. I think in general, there's a lot of agreement that that's the direction that we should go, but we struggle to do it in practice. And again, you know, we've seen that in Ukraine, in that on paper, it's a context where there's lots of opportunities to do it, but it's complex. It requires coordination. It requires, you know, often the right types of funding. It requires an understanding of the systems that are in place. And so, yeah, I think it's still a sort of learning curve on how that can be done, but one we really need to prioritize. Thank you.